Hi, welcome to our roundtable chat. We are here today with our lead educators, Professor Jim Burgess and Professor Axel Bruns. And they are joined today by Digital Media Research Center colleagues, Dr. Stephen Harrington and PhD candidate Stephanie Duguay. We are live streaming here from QUT in Brisbane, and we are going to take some of your questions. But to get us started, we got some questions already from our learners, and they are really interested in the debates around fake news and filter bubbles and the importance of using digital methods to make sense of these issues online. So maybe we can start with this, Axel. Maybe?
Sure. Of course, this is a question that is very much front and center right now with everything that's going on. And I think, look, yes, very clearly there is a lot of useful contribution that social media research can make in this field to understand maybe not so much what news is fake and what news is real, because that ultimately is in the eye of the beholder to some point, to some degree. But at the same time, at least to track how news spreads via social media to begin with. So who's sharing what kinds of news sources, what kinds of stories, what kinds of articles, how is that disseminated across the networks? Are there particular accounts, for instance, that are particularly active in sharing this? And can we perhaps even identify some patterns that look coordinated, where you have a whole bunch of accounts that are sharing the same article virtually at the same time, which ends up looking very suspicious and may point us then to a whole set of bots, for instance, sharing a particular news article that makes this or that politician look bad or look good. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff, I think, that social media analytics certainly can do quite easily. And I think many of our participants, if you're looking at what news is being shared, you might actually find that there are some unusual, suspicious patterns in what is being shared.
And also maybe the challenges of the network communication. So by studying how they spread in different social media platforms, I don't know if you want to add something.
Well, I think that sometimes this debate gets a bit simplified. So suggesting that all social media makes all of our experience of the news environment quite atomized, or that we only follow people who agree with us and so on. I think that's probably more true, for example, if you use Twitter just as a professional channel for a very narrow field. But like me. Yeah, okay, like Steph does at the moment, yeah. Whereas I've always used Twitter as a very personal mixture of my professional life, my friendships, and so I actually encounter quite a lot of different perspectives. So one thing that we can do with the type of methods that we're doing in this course is we can identify different kinds of patterns of follower-followee networks, which we get to a little later, I think.
Well, interaction networks as well, of course, yeah.
And as Axel said, the deliberate spread of disinformation or a fake news story can be detected by patterns in the data, just like you can find spam by accounts that only seem to that follow millions of people or users and don't have any followers, all tweeting something at the same time.
Or have spam. One tweet ever.
One tweet ever. Yeah.
Well, actually, one of our learners was asking also if we should account for the bot, or if we should remove the bot from our data set. So what do you think about this kind of noise? Is it part of the conversation and it helps us understand the new dynamics, or should we just ignore it?
I would say it depends on what you find is going on with the bot. Are people actually engaging with it? Are they not? What is that bot setting out to do? I mean, again, these are kind of questions that everyone might have different sort of answers to. But that's the point. It's actually being able to first of all identify what is happening with these bots, or call them what you will, and then finding out, okay, are they just communicating with each other? Are people just using it to sort of boost their follower networks, or are they actually responsible for the spread of information in a certain way?
And what are you trying to display there, I guess, as well? I mean, if what you're trying to document in your research is the experience that an ordinary user might have following a particular hashtag, for instance, well, then the bots are certainly part of that. And in fact, the hashtag itself might become unusable if there are too many bots in there and just spamming the hashtag with all sorts of unrelated materials. So if you took all of that out and ignored it, you would represent something that isn't the experience, the actual lived experience of the users who might be following that hashtag. At the same time, if of course you're interested in who the most active accounts are that are contributing meaningful information to a particular discussion, then yes, perhaps you end up taking the bots out because they are clearly not part of the discussion itself. So it depends on the question, I think, that you're asking.
You've done some analysis too on Twitter, and did you encounter some bots? Did you use them in your own research?
Yeah, I was going to say, even, you might come across a bot that seems really benign, right? So I came across a bot, I was doing some research with Canadian tweets, and there was a bot that was programmed just to retweet anything that said Ontario, because it was like a Tourism Ontario account, right? But then if you have lots of people tweeting about Ontario politics, then suddenly this tourism bot is involved in this political debate, and it's amplifying certain views, and other people can, engineer their tweets to also be retweeted by it, right?
Yeah.
So it's really part of the whole conversation.
Yeah, and bots, in some cases are really useful. I mean, I used to follow an account that would automatically tweet at me from a bot when the International Space Station was going to be visible over my house. And often I would retweet that, locally to my networks, or I would just retweet it as a kind of point of saying it. That's a bot, but that's something that actually was meaningful to me and was useful. I mean, it was just kind of a practical application. But to suggest that bots are good for nothing but spam is incorrect. As you say, it's simplistic.
And like we've been saying, it depends what research paradigm you're coming from. So if you're a behavioural social scientist and you think Twitter is a space where human beings interact with each other and that each account is a human being, well, that's a different kind of research from what we're doing here. It's also wrong because accounts can belong to organisations, multiple people can share an account and one person can have multiple accounts. And bots are just part of Twitter, and there's lots of different kinds of bots. So some of them are really creative, some of them are really useful, some of them are mischievous, some of them are just annoying. And it's important, I think, if you're going to study a social media platform, to understand everything that goes on it and not just try to delete what you see as noise.
Yeah.
And even spam can tell you a lot, right?
Right.
So collecting...
Oh, hello everyone.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi.
And we're back.
And
we
we're
are
back.
back. Yeah. So we are going to move to the second main question that we encountered during the MOOC. It goes around privacy and ethics. So I'm going to read one of the questions that one of our learners said. Natasha asks, how does the advice given by privacy advocates like Snowden relate to our ability to conduct social media research? For example, in this course, we need a Google and Twitter account before we can use tags to access Twitter data. So all these issues, how can we, the challenges of do this kind of research and relating to privacy and ethics.
Well, there's probably two parts to it, just to unpack the question a bit. One part of it is thinking about really whether it's possible to do digital media research in a meaningful way without participating, having accounts and sort of having our own lives entangled with those platforms.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other part of it is thinking about participants' privacy and ethics in gathering data on Twitter. So we do discuss this a little bit in the course, but I don't know, Steph or Stephen, do you have...
Yeah, I think it's very important to think about participant data, especially because if you're gathering large amounts of data, you can't always check. It's not feasible to check with thousands of Twitter users if you can use their photo in a presentation or whatnot. But it might be possible to contact one or two people if you are going to reproduce their work. Sometimes it's a bit of a better bet to use politicians or people who are already in the public eye if you need an example for a paper or a presentation, because they're already expecting that level of publicness.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, as you rightly identified, Jean, that this works on a number of levels, both as researchers, how data is gathered, and then also how data is presented as well. It's complex, and as you say, there is it is nearly impossible to not. It's impossible to do this research without, as you say, yourself being a participant in some sort of way. But as well, thinking about the different ways in which that data could be misused. I mean, we obviously have to think about the fact that, as you say, it's not just that audiences haven't given permission, or users haven't given their permission. It's also an issue that they haven't even they've often done activity and tweeted, for example, without any expectation that would go any further than, let's say, a follower network. So it is it's basically a fraught process in some ways, and it just needs to be thought about, and people just need to be conscious of what the potential consequences are.
It needs to constantly be thought about and worked through by
there's
researchers,
never,
so you never turn off your ethical.
No, exactly. It needs to be an ongoing thought process, because there's never an end point to that.
There's never one size fits all. And so
that's right. And I mean, getting back to Steph's point about the reproduction, ultimately the public reproduction of what you've gathered as well. I mean, for instance, even with politicians, if someone tweets something and then deletes it because they've been criticised for what they've been saying, well, how do you deal with that? What is the most ethical approach? They are in the public eye, and maybe for that reason it's important to document when a politician says a racist thing, for instance. At the same time, if they've then deleted it and we keep reproducing it in our own work, then of course we perpetuate the damage that they've already done to themselves and to their reputation. And there is an ethical question about that, of course, as well. And at the same time, of course, if you do reproduce anything from non-public actors, from people who aren't in the public eye, I think it's also really important to remind people there you can do that, I guess, to some extent by anonymizing them, by removing their Twitter handle, the name that they've given themselves. But even if as long as you still cite the actual tweet itself verbatim, of course, someone could still Google that and go back to the original person. Quote from it, exactly. So that's also important to keep that in mind, that a lot of this ultimately remains very much traceable to the originator, unless you entirely paraphrase it, and then of course you've lost a lot of the context of the tweet itself.
Well, I was just going to say, on the other hand, because we're not behavioural scientists, we don't see everyone on Twitter as research subjects. We see them as authors and creators sometimes. So what if you're doing a study on the funniest jokes on Twitter and you anonymise the author? They're probably going to be kind of pissed off that you did that, rather than, thank you for keeping my privacy. So you have to understand the different kinds of communication going on and be sensitive to context. You can't just set up a rule and follow it.
No, that's right.
But it's an ongoing process, and there are some rules from the Association of Internet Researchers, so it's being built up, and so.
And these are rules that have been evolving over time as well. They're not simply fixed, so we constantly revisit them.
Yes, it's like best practice rather than.
And I think we really need to be critical, as with all things, of the concept of privacy and how it's come to be the overarching value of thinking about ethics, because it might be more important to be concerned about whether people feel constrained from participating in a public space rather than whether their privacy is being protected. So different kinds of ethics too.
Perfect. We have another question from Audrey, and she's a PhD researcher, and she would like to know about ways to analyze visual data like memes, because there are many more digital that we can cover in one chat, but can you talk about the ways in which we could do research with visual data or objects like apps, so approaches to this kind of material?
Well, with great difficulty in some ways, certainly at large scale, because of course, I mean, as you know from doing this course and working with tags, we get the tweet texts, and the tweet texts might have links in them, for instance. But we, of course, don't get the image objects themselves as part of this. So in the end, we'd have to resolve all the links, work out whether they in fact are images or videos or something else, and probably then go to those sites and get those images, gather those images. Now you can automate some of that process. You can write various scripts that do this, that identify all the links, resolve them, work out whether it's a Twitter image, for instance, or an Instagram photo or something else, and gathers all of that. But then you still have the problem of doing anything meaningful with that, because you might have 1,000, 10,000 images as part of your data set, and then you have to work out how to process that in some form. Now there are now some evolving, emerging image processing tools out there. Google provides some, and there are some packages for languages like Python and R, for instance, that also deal with image processing. So that's certainly possible if you want to go further and do this more computationally. Alternatively, of course, you can select probably a smaller sample of images and do some manual coding and work with that, or of course just a close reading of those images.
Yeah, there's
to
always
understand
there's
what-
still a role for
Yeah.
interpretative work
Precisely.
and for good old content analysis.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
might need a few people to help.
Yes,
but
Yeah.
yes.
And maybe you can talk a bit about the work-through method too, that it's just visually you can also make sense about technosocial mechanisms. And
Yeah, I think it's
Media.
very important to look at the context that the visual media is in. Jean Burgess and Ben Light and I have developed a method called the app walkthrough, and we use it to really closely look at apps, look at their vision, their governance, their operating model, and also look at the technological architecture and how that frames people's content, right? So, there's lots around a visual piece of media, like hashtags and links and things like that, and the way that users encounter that shapes how they interpret it as well.
exactly.
So understanding not just the tweets, for example with Twitter, but how the tweets appear in an app through its interface, and how that app might sit on a mobile device that you carry around with you, and thinking about that part of the context is important as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you go further into the Twitter data, you can actually find a field where it tells you what software the tweet has been posted from, so you can see if it's from an iPhone or from a desktop. So that can be cool
From
too.
Donald Trump's phone or from media.
Yeah, from
Yeah.
Donald Trump's phone or his media teams.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thought we were going to get through this whole thing without
Sorry.
mentioning Donald Trump,
Sorry.
but
Yeah, no.
And related to this metadata, we also had a lot of questions about access to this data, and then if you can get historical data, APIs, platforms closing APIs. So maybe we can talk about a bit about the consequences of relying on these proprietary platforms and doing research about them.
Well, look, access, particularly to historical data, is not straightforward. As you know, again, from doing this course, of course, we tend to gather forward rather than backwards. So we end up, starting a search, starting the tracker, and then gather everything that happens from that point onwards. Going backwards through the standard Twitter API is very, very limited. You can gather maybe up to a week's tweets or so backwards. Using other tools than the ones that we're using here, but really nothing much more beyond that. If you want to go further back, if you're interested in historical data around a particular event, for instance, there are tools like Discover Text and a commercial service called GNIP, which is owned by Twitter. Both of those provide historical data as well, but beyond entry-level just trial access, you will have to pay for the data most likely. And that, of course, is a very significant limitation. That really means that a lot of the Twitter research ends up being more kind of forward-looking or live research rather than long-term historical comparison of data.
But I guess stepping back from that a bit further, one of the reasons that we're using Twitter data in this course and that so much of this sort of work is done with Twitter is that it was comparatively open in terms of data access historically. It's closed over time as Twitter tried to get more control over the user experience and tried to find ways to make money from the data themselves. It's become harder and harder. So there used to be public trackers where if I set up a hashtag tracker, then you, Ariadne, could come along and download it even if we didn't know each other. So it has closed down, but it's still comparatively very open. And that's partly because Twitter as a platform, for communication, is more open and public, or understood to be.
I was gutted last year when Instagram decided
Exactly.
to close access
What
to
I
its
was about to
API.
ask, because a lot of people are asking, but can we use Facebook to do this?
Right.
Can we use
Yeah.
Instagram?
Yeah.
And we try to, just say that there are limitations, no? So, I don't know if you want to just say more about this.
Well,
what
just
happened?
that, from what I know about it, there was a major shift kind of in the way that Instagram was approaching researchers and other people who wanted to use its API, and so now there's this sort of complicated application process, and a lot of researchers who apply for access to the API are declined. So tools that I was using for my thesis and to gather data, they don't work anymore. So it's it was a lesson in definitely completing data collection expediently.
But yeah, there is a risk there with relying on a proprietary, a commercial platform to keep providing access to the data, because in corporations things change quickly, their business model changes. They're really not getting a monetary benefit from it. So
Yeah.
So we always need to have
Twitter
mixed
especially.
methods in mind, don't we?
Yeah, that's
And
right.
It's perhaps worth saying too that in a number of platforms, the APIs tend to provide very much information that's centered around your own account, the account that you're gathering data with. So if you were tracking on Facebook, you'd see what happens in your network, but you couldn't see on a much broader scale everyone who writes something about a particular topic that you're interested in. That is still one of the big benefits of Twitter as well, because there what we're gathering from the API are ostensibly all the tweets that mention a particular hashtag or keyword, independent of whether you as a user are connected with them or not. And that's one of those big differences, and one of the reasons that Twitter is kind of useful for this. But that could also change, of course.
Yeah.
And if that changes, then we have none of the major platforms that really provide that sort of generic, comprehensive data on what its users are currently doing.
That plus a lot of social media is retreating to chat rooms or to chat based or interpersonal messaging.
Private spaces.
Spaces. So the public sphere is still there, but it's not as visible in the traditional sense of public. So that's a big challenge for our methods too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that we've run out of time, but thank you very much for your insights and thank you for following us. If we haven't answered your questions, we will try to do it over the next week. And yeah, we'll see you in Future Learn.
See you in
Thank
future.
you. Yeah.
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you.
Bye.